What if I told you that Queen Elizabeth in her final days left behind a message so shocking, so disturbing that it could tear apart everything you thought you knew about Prince Harry, Meghan Markle, and their children? Imagine the weight of a secret so heavy that it could only be revealed after her death. A truth hidden in shadows, locked away in sealed letters and private archives, waiting for the right moment to detonate. This isn't gossip. This isn't tabloid fantasy. This is the story of betrayal, of deception, of a monarchy shaken to its very core. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Pause for a moment. Think about the Queen. For 70 years, she was the face of stability, the matriarch of the world's most famous family. Through wars, scandals, and crisis, she remained the one constant, always poised, always calm, always in control. And yet, in those final months, when the world thought she was quietly preparing for the end, she was preparing something else entirely. Evidence, warnings, and a message that directly named Harry and Meghan. Why them? Why, in all the turmoil of her reign, would her dying words circle back to the Sussexes? The answer lies in a story of fraud, a fraud not just against the monarchy, but against history itself, a fraud that touches Archie, a fraud that touches Lilet. A fraud that, if proven, would mean the children the world believes are royal heirs may not even exist in the way we've been told. And the Queen knew it. She didn't just suspect. She left behind the trail. Now picture this. It's late evening at Windsor Castle. The Queen, frail but sharp, sits with her private secretary. On the desk lies a stack of papers, sealed envelopes, handwritten notes, documents stamped with quiet authority. She speaks in her steady, deliberate tone, the same voice that once calmed nations during wartime. But this time, she isn't addressing a country. She's addressing the future of her family. Her words, though spoken softly, carry the force of thunder. They reveal that Harry and Meghan staged pregnancies, that Archie and Lilet's official records were manipulated, that the monarchy was defrauded from within. Let that sink in. The Queen, the very embodiment of duty and tradition, accused her own grandson and his wife of committing the unthinkable. Can you imagine the emotional weight of that? A grandmother forced to confront betrayal, a sovereign forced to protect her crown from her own bloodline. And here's the part that should send chills down your spine. She didn't reveal it during her life. She waited. She planned for the evidence to surface only after she was gone. Why? Because she knew the storm it would unleash. She knew the backlash, the disbelief, the chaos. She knew that if she spoke while alive, the institution might crumble under the pressure. But after her death, that would be the moment no one could stop it. The bomb would detonate without her being there to absorb the blow. Ask yourself this. How far would someone go to protect their legacy? Would they write down the most dangerous truth of their reign and leave it behind like a ticking time bomb? Would they trust the world to uncover it when the time was right? That's exactly what the Queen did. Now, let's talk about why this matters today. Think about Harry and Meghan's public image. To some, they're rebels, victims of an outdated monarchy, freedom fighters carving their own path. To others, they're opportunists, liars, manipulators. But no matter which side you're on, their children, Archie and Lilet, were always portrayed as innocent, untouchable beyond reproach, the living proof of their legitimacy. Yet what if that very proof is false? What if those children's births were staged, their documents falsified, their very existence wrapped in a carefully manufactured lie? That isn't just a scandal. That's history rewritten. And let's not forget, this is a monarchy built on lineage. Bloodlines matter, succession matters, the legitimacy of heirs is not a trivial detail. It's the cornerstone of royal power. If Archie and Lib's births are fraudulent, then every title they hold, every place they occupy in the line of succession is a lie. And if that lie was knowingly perpetuated by Harry and Meghan, then we're not talking about a personal family drama anymore. We are talking about a constitutional crisis. Do you see the scale? Now this isn't just about a grandmother's disapproval. This is about fraud on the highest stage, fraud against the crown itself, and the Queen in her final days pointed directly to it. But how do we know this? How can we say with certainty that Elizabeth left such a message? That's where the evidence comes in. Private notes, altered documents, testimonies from palace staff, accounts that were hidden, buried under layers of secrecy until after her passing. The Queen ensured they would survive her. She knew one day the world would look for answers, and when they did, her message would be waiting. And here's the irony. Meghan named her daughter Lilet, a name that was the Queen's most private treasure, her childhood nickname, used only by those closest to her. It was supposed to be an honor, but imagine the pain, the searing betrayal if the Queen believed that very child's birth was fraudulent. The irony cuts like a knife. The name meant to honor her instead became tied to the very fraud she sought to expose. Let me ask you this. What does it do to a monarch's soul to write that kind of message? To accuse her grandson and his wife of fraud, of deception, of manipulating the world. The Queen was no stranger to scandal. She had weathered Diana, Charles, Camilla, Andrew, even Meghan herself. But this was different because this wasn't about personal failings or messy divorces. This was about rewriting the future of the monarchy with lies, and that she could not ignore. Now don't misunderstand, she wasn't reckless, she didn't go public with a tabloid-style announcement. She was deliberate, methodical, strategic. She left behind what could be considered a trail of breadcrumbs, letters, documents, testimonies, enough to ensure the truth could not be buried forever. Enough to ensure that one day the story would surface like it is now, and you right now are part of that uncovering. You are hearing the story the Queen wanted the world to hear. You are stepping into the shadows of Windsor, into the private chambers of Buckingham, into the whispered warnings that were never meant to die with her. So, let me ask you again. What if I told you the Queen's final words weren't about love or legacy, or even her decades of service? What if her final words were a warning about Harry and Meghan, about Archie and Lilet, about fraud, about deception? Because here's the reality. She knew, she saw, and she left the evidence behind. But this is only the beginning, because the first clue that shattered the illusion wasn't found in a letter or a speech or a diary. It was found in a place no one expected. A place that exposed the fraud in a way that no denial could erase. And once that first clue came to light, everything else began to unravel. What if the very first clue to this fraud wasn't hidden in a secret vault or buried in some dusty archive, but staring everyone in the face all along? What if the illusion cracked not with a grand confession, but with a small, almost forgettable detail, something the Queen herself noticed and quietly flagged before she died? That's where this story begins. With a detail, a place no one thought to look, a clue so subtle it was overlooked for years until it wasn't. And when it was finally pieced together, it shattered the narrative Harry and Meghan had worked so hard to build. Now imagine the Queen late at night, reviewing official papers as she so often did. Her eyesight wasn't what it used to be, but her mind remained razor-sharp. She spotted something, a line that didn't add up, a date that didn't match, a signature that looked different from the rest. To most, it would have been meaningless, but to her, it was the first domino. She circled it. She wrote a note in her delicate looping handwriting. And that note would later become the first spark in the fire of suspicion. Here's the question you have to ask yourself. If you were the monarch trained for a lifetime to detect inconsistencies, to spot when people were lying, would you have ignored it? Or would you have done exactly what she did? Mark it, save it, and set it aside for the day when the truth would have to come out. The detail was small, almost laughably small, but it opened the door. It raised the question, what else wasn't real? Let's rewind for a moment. Think back to 2019, the year Archie was born. The world was captivated by Meghan's pregnancy. Every magazine cover, every tabloid, every royal watcher was obsessed. But there was a problem. The pregnancy didn't look consistent. Meghan's baby bump seemed to appear and disappear. In some photos, it shifted unnaturally. In others, it ballooned overnight. People whispered about moon bumps, prosthetics, staged appearances. Of course, at the time, most dismissed it as conspiracy theories, wild internet chatter, nothing to take seriously. But here's where it gets interesting. The Queen didn't dismiss it. She noticed it too, and while she never said anything publicly behind palace walls, she asked questions, direct questions, questions no one wanted to answer. Why did Meghan's medical team keep changing? Why were standard procedures avoided? Why was the hospital location kept vague? Why did the palace refuse the traditional photo op outside the hospital doors, a royal custom going back generations? Do you see the pattern yet? Each answer led to more questions. And each question only deepened the suspicion. And then came the document, the official record of Archie's birth, a document that on the surface seemed ordinary. But the Queen noticed something strange, a discrepancy. Perhaps it was the doctor's name, perhaps it was the location listed, perhaps it was the timing. Whichever it was, it stood out to her because she knew how these records were supposed to look. She had signed off on thousands over her lifetime, and this one didn't fit. Now, pause here. Ask yourself, if the Queen spotted something odd, how many others did too? Was it truly hidden or simply ignored because of who it involved? Isn't it strange that the most public family in the world could still manage to keep such details under wraps? The clue led her down a path. Quietly, discreetly, she began compiling what she suspected. Not an investigation in the formal sense, more like a private ledger of truths, a ledger only she could keep. And in that ledger, she wrote about Archie, she wrote about Lilet, she wrote about the inconsistencies that no one dared say out loud. And here's the chilling part, she didn't just collect facts. She collected testimonies, staff members who had seen too much, nurses who had been sworn to silence, security personnel who noticed odd comings and goings at strange hours. Each piece added weight to her suspicion, each voice added credibility, and yet she stayed silent. Why? Because timing is everything. The Queen understood timing better than anyone. A word spoken too soon could destroy stability. A revelation made in the wrong moment could topple the crown, so she waited, she endured. She let the world believe what it wanted to believe until the day she no longer could. Think about how heartbreaking that must have been. Watching her grandson parade around as a father, knowing the story didn't add up. Smiling for the cameras while behind closed doors, writing down words like fraud, forgery staged. Imagine the conflict inside her, grandmotherly love colliding with sovereign duty, which mattered more, her personal bond or the truth, and still the detail nodded her. That first clue, that small crack in the facade, she knew what it meant, she knew where it pointed, and that's why she wrote it down, because she knew one day someone would need to follow that trail. Here's the irony. The Queen was known for discretion, for never revealing her inner thoughts. Yet in this case, she revealed more than anyone expected, just not out loud. Her handwriting became her voice, her notes became her confession. Let me ask you this, do you think Harry knew she was suspicious? Do you think Meghan realized the Queen was quietly cataloguing evidence against them? Or did they believe they had fooled her completely, that she of all people would never notice? That arrogance, that belief they could outmaneuver the sharpest mind in the monarchy was their first mistake. Because she noticed, she always noticed. And as the months went by, more clues appeared, more inconsistencies, more reasons to doubt. What began as one small detail grew into a mountain of evidence. A mountain so large, so undeniable that it could no longer be ignored. But here's the twist. That first clue, the one she circled late at night at Windsor, it wasn't just a clerical error. It wasn't just a smudge of ink or a misplaced line. It was something far more damning, something that pointed directly to forgery. Something that proved the narrative Harry and Meghan had spun could not possibly be true. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Once it's exposed, the entire house of cards begins to collapse. So the Queen left it there for someone else to uncover, for history to judge. She left behind the first clue, the spark that would ignite everything that followed. But that was only the beginning. Because what came next wasn't just about documents, it wasn't about papers or signatures, it was about witnesses, people who saw, who heard, who knew, and who carried their secrets in silence. And when those witnesses began to speak, even in whispers, the truth became impossible to contain. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What happens when whispers start to form patterns, when rumors begin to align with facts, when coincidences suddenly don't look like coincidences anymore? That's exactly what Queen Elizabeth understood. She knew that one strange document could be explained away. One inconsistency could be brushed aside. But when you stack them together, when you hear the same suspicious detail echoed from different corners, it stops being noise. It becomes truth hiding in plain sight. And that's where the Queen's instincts kicked in. She had lived through decades of scandals, abdications, divorces, affairs, even outright betrayals. She knew how stories got spun. She knew how half-truths became official narratives, but this was something darker. This wasn't just a cover-up. This was orchestration, a deliberate construction of a lie so bold it fooled the entire world. The Queen never trusted coincidences. She'd been taught from a young age that in royal life, coincidences rarely exist. Everything is planned. Every moment, every photo, every appearance, rehearsed and managed to perfection. So when things began to look sloppy, when details didn't line up, she didn't chalk it up to chance. She saw intention. Think about Archie's birth announcement. Normally, royal births follow a pattern. The hospital steps, the proud parents, the newborn presented to the nation. But Harry and Meghan broke tradition. No photos outside the hospital, no immediate introduction, just vague statements and a tightly controlled appearance days later. At the time, it was spun as modern and private. But to the Queen, it was suspicious, too controlled, too secretive. And then there was the doctor. Officially, a certain name appeared on the records. But palace insiders whispered that doctor was never seen entering the ward, that another physician had been scheduled that day, that shifts were rearranged at the last minute. Coincidence or stagecraft? Let me ask you, if everything was real, why all the smoke and mirrors? Why the constant evasions? Wouldn't it have been easier, safer to follow tradition, to present the baby like every other royal before him? Unless, of course, there was something to hide. That's the question that gnawed at the Queen, and she wasn't alone. Behind the palace walls, a handful of staff began to murmur, midwives who suddenly found themselves reassigned. Assistants who were told to deliver props instead of medical supplies. Security guards asked to block corridors at odd hours. Individually, these details sounded absurd. But together, they painted a picture that was impossible to ignore, and the Queen, ever the archivist of truth, began to collect them. She asked careful questions. She took mental notes. She quietly summoned her most trusted aides and pressed them for details. What did they see? What did they hear? Did anything feel unusual? And every time she asked, the answers pointed in the same direction. Something wasn't right. Now here's where the story gets darker. It wasn't just about Archie. By the time Meghan announced she was pregnant with Lilet, the whispers had turned into a storm. Staff were openly skeptical. The Queen herself had already begun recording her suspicions in writing. And yet the same patterns repeated: the secrecy, the inconsistencies, the evasions. Do you see the contradiction here? On one hand, Harry and Meghan preached transparency. They sat on Oprah's couch claiming to tell their truth. They spoke about authenticity, honesty, breaking away from palace control. But on the other hand, their pregnancies, the most natural, relatable experiences, were shrouded in mystery. Why? Why be open about feuds and mental health, but secretive about the one thing that could have silenced every critic instantly? Because maybe it wasn't true. Maybe the story couldn't withstand transparency. And this is where the Queen's private secretary comes into play. Imagine being in that position, tasked with recording history, protecting the crown, and serving the monarch herself. One evening, as the Queen reviewed her notes, she called the secretary into her private chamber. On the desk lay not just the suspicious documents, but a sealed envelope. Inside, a handwritten statement in the Queen's unmistakable script. In it, she described the fraud in stark terms, a deception of the crown, a betrayal of lineage. Those words from the Queen carried weight heavier than any tabloid headline. They weren't speculation, they weren't gossip, they were an accusation. Now stop and think. Why would she put those words to paper? Why risk history judging her as conspiratorial if she wasn't certain? Would she really gamble her reputation, the reputation of a monarch known for restraint, on something flimsy? Or was she writing down what she already knew to be true? The Queen never trusted coincidences, and by this point she had gathered too many to ignore. The timing of announcements, the inconsistencies in appearances, the whispers from staff, the irregularities in documents. One could be explained, two could be excused, but 10, 15, 20, that wasn't coincidence. That was orchestration. And here's where it turns almost cinematic. One aide under strict confidentiality described a moment when Meghan's pregnancy bump appeared to fold unnaturally as she bent forward. The Queen saw the clip herself circulated quietly among palace insiders. Her face remained impassive, but her silence spoke volumes. She wrote another note that night. The file grew thicker. So here's the contradiction that defines this chapter. Harry and Meghan demanded privacy, yet staged spectacle. They claimed authenticity, yet built layers of deception. And the Queen, she saw through it patiently, relentlessly, quietly. But here's the kicker. It wasn't just about suspicion anymore. It was about evidence. And that evidence, the Queen knew, wouldn't stay buried forever, because the very same private secretary who read her words also discovered something else. Something buried deep in the palace archives. A document so sensitive it had been locked away, forgotten by all but a few. And when he placed it on the Queen's desk, she knew instantly this was no longer whispers. This was proof, and that proof would lead to the next revelation. One so shocking it made even the Queen catch her breath. But what came next would change the story forever, and not even the palace could contain it. What if I told you that everything you thought you knew about Archie's birth, the timeline, the story, the carefully staged announcements, was built on a lie? That the Queen herself suspected the fraud began right there in 2019 when Meghan and Harry presented their first child to the world. This is where the fraud begins. Let's rewind. It was May 6, 2019. The palace issued its official announcement. Meghan Markle had given birth to a healthy baby boy. Royal fans across the globe erupted with excitement. The press flooded every screen, headlines screaming with joy. But then, almost immediately, something strange happened. No hospital steps, no baby in Harry's arms outside St. Mary's or Portland Hospital, the way it had been for William and Kate or Diana and Charles. No photo op that had been a royal tradition for decades. Instead, the palace announced Meghan had gone into labor hours after she had already given birth. The timeline didn't line up. The announcement contradicted itself. It was a mess. And here's where it gets interesting. The Queen noticed she had lived through every royal birth for generations. She knew the protocols inside out. Yet Harry and Meghan's handling of Archie's arrival broke every single one of them. Why? Now, think about Meghan's pregnancy appearances. Go back and watch those public engagements. One day the bump looked huge. The next day almost flat. At one event, the bump even seemed to shift unnaturally when she bent forward. People joked online, calling it the moon bump. Internet forums lit up with debates, mocking the inconsistencies. At the time, mainstream outlets dismissed it as nonsense, but behind closed doors, the Queen wasn't laughing. She was watching closely, and she wasn't convinced. Ask yourself, if everything was normal, why the secrecy? Why the games? Why the refusal to follow the one tradition every royal mother before Meghan had followed? Diana did it. Kate did it 3 times, even Fergie. Why not Meghan? Because perhaps Meghan couldn't. And then came the document, the official birth certificate. At first glance, it seemed ordinary, but as the Queen studied it, something caught her attention. The attending physician's name, the registered location, something didn't match the standard protocols. She underlined it in her private notes. She wrote one word beside it: fraud. Let me ask you, would a monarch who had signed off on countless official documents really mistake a minor detail? Or was she seeing what others ignored? And the contradictions kept piling up. The announcement from Buckingham Palace claimed Meghan went into labor early that morning. Yet, by the time the statement was released, the baby had already been born hours earlier. How does that make sense? Why mislead the public about something as straightforward as labor unless the labor never happened? Here's another striking fact. Meghan and Harry refused to reveal where the birth took place. At first, the palace hinted it might be the Portland Hospital in London. Later, some claimed it was at Frogmore Cottage, but no official confirmation ever came. The secrecy was suffocating, almost as if there was no hospital birth to reveal. Now put yourself in the Queen's shoes. She watched her grandson present a child to the world while dodging basic, simple questions. She saw her family's credibility being mocked online. She saw contradictions in the official paperwork, and she asked herself the same question we're asking now. What really happened the day Archie was born? Here's where the story takes a chilling turn. Several palace staff, bound by confidentiality, later admitted things didn't feel right. One aide recalled being told to prepare rooms at Frogmore Cottage, as if a baby was arriving, not from the hospital, but as if it was being brought in. Another remembered hearing whispers that Meghan had not been admitted to any maternity ward in London at all. Can you imagine the tension in those halls? Staff ordered to play along while the Queen herself quietly took note. And what about Harry? Did he know? Was he complicit, or was he swept up in Meghan's deception, too blinded by love to question it? That's a question the Queen herself struggled with. In her private writings, she never fully blamed Harry. She referred instead to the deception of the crown and false heirs. The focus was always sharper when it came to Meghan, but let's not forget the monarchy is built on lineage. Bloodlines matter. If Archie's birth wasn't legitimate, if the records were falsified, then his place in the line of succession was fraudulent. That wasn't just a family embarrassment. That was a constitutional crisis. And the Queen knew it. Now, let's talk about that first public appearance of Archie. Just 2 days after the supposed birth, Harry and Meghan stood in St. George's Hall at Windsor Castle, introducing him to the cameras. The world was enchanted, but look closer. The lighting was odd. Meghan looked strangely stiff. The baby wrapped so tightly, you could barely see his face never moved. Some observers swore his skin tone and size didn't match a 2-day-old infant. Do you remember the Queen and Prince Philip's appearance in that photo? They stood beside Harry and Meghan, smiling dutifully, peering at the baby. But behind her polite smile, the Queen's eyes told another story. She was already suspicious, already aware of the inconsistencies, already writing down her concerns in the private notes that would one day expose it all. And here's the ultimate irony. Meghan wanted to reinvent royal motherhood, to break traditions, to do it her way. But in doing so, she drew even more attention to the very deception she was trying to hide. The Queen saw it, the staff saw it, and eventually the public saw it too. But here's the question. If Archie's birth was staged, what did that mean for Elizabeth? Would the same pattern repeat? Would the fraud escalate? The Queen already knew the answer.